The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right, hi everybody, this is Karen. I'm just going to give folks a couple more minutes to sign on and then we will get started. And Jen and Taylor, if you guys could mute yourselves. All right, I think we have sort of a full hour, so I don't want to wait too much longer. So maybe I'll go ahead and get started, and hopefully the rest of the folks that we're expecting will join. So hi everybody, welcome to the February webinar. This is our report on year 3 updates based on the community level findings. And here's what we want to do today. So we're going to share results in sort of 4 different categories. You'll see some updated results from the core questions. We have some new results for you today that build on a recent publication that came out in the literature in the fall, but then also start to look at some of the data based on festival type, which is something that several of you mentioned as an interest in some of the sort of one-on-one conversations we've had in the last few years. We're going to look at some annual comparisons across multiple years of data that we have so far, and then we'll end with a focus on what you value and what you use based on some of the research data that we've collected over the last few years. So as always, we are going to begin with shout outs. The first one goes to Jen, who basically did almost all of the work that you're going to see today. So I'm going to turn things over to Jen in just a second or two. She has been the one who has slaved away looking at different analysis of our data and made the bulk of the presentation today. So a huge thank you to Jen for that work. We also want to give a shout out to Amy Grack-Nelson and her team, and this also provides an update for you guys. So as you'll remember, we are working on a follow-up survey that people can use instead of or in addition to the attendee survey for this year to meet your data collection requirements. And Amy's team has been doing Think Aloud work for that new instrument. The results from that are going to be available in a couple weeks, and data collection actually wraps up this week. So they jumped straight into that, and we're excited to see what they find out when we get that report back in just a couple weeks' time. Without further ado, I am going to hand things over to Jen. And actually, give me just a second. Jen, I'm going to let you drive.
Okay.
So I'm going to change the presenter to you. And there you go.
All right. Thanks, Karen. All right. So just a little bit of information about our cumulative data set. At this point, we have 31,420 data points. Just over 10,000 of those are coming from year 1, 11,000 from year 2, and then almost 10,000 from year 3. So today we're going to break down the findings in a couple of different ways. We'll start first with covering some of the demographic items from year 3 data only. So here you see demographics by gender and age for year 3. And you can see that we have more female than male participants in the sample, and that about 2/3 of our survey sample is comprised of adults aged 25 and up. So the age data come from the first age question on the survey. And that means for those of you who asked the kid questions, you have additional age data from the adults who took over the iPad after the kid questions are done. Those ages are not included in the display here. Instead, these numbers show the ages of the person who began taking the survey. It's also interesting to note that many of these percentages by age group change very little, if at all, from year 2 to year 3. And here we have race data, and we are comparing it to census data. And what we see from results is that, oops, hold on, trying to minimize here. Okay, so what we see from the results here is that Pacific Islanders, American Indians, and Asians are overrepresented in our attendee data, and that suggests that these groups are also overrepresented among festival attendees. We also looked at the range for each of these racial categories across festivals, and you'll see there is a very wide range in some cases, and then a very narrow range in some cases. So for groups like Pacific Islander and American Indians, we're talking about a very, very small group across all festivals. And then when we think about STEM majority groups, we see that there's a much larger range among festivals. So about 80% of attendees were there with at least one child. So 20% of our attendees were not. We did break down the age data and asked for folks to report on those categories of children that were with them in their party. So it's one thing to note here also, these categories are not mutually exclusive. So these percentages are not going to add up to 100%. But you can see from the results that among those folks who were there with children, those children tended to be younger in age. So 64% reported being there with at least one child of elementary school age, and then almost 30% reported being there with a child 5 years or younger. So we'll move on here to think a little bit about education. And it's important to note that education level is not a core question, and not all festivals ask this, but many do. And we ended up this year with just under 2,400 data points. So keeping that in mind, on average, 33% of Americans hold bachelor's degrees and 12% hold graduate degrees. Festival attendees captured here in our data certainly seem to be smarter than the average bear. Well, perhaps not smarter, because bears are pretty smart, but certainly more educated. Also, a couple of points to note about what you're seeing here on this slide. The top bar for high school, that is not a mutually exclusive category. So we're thinking, as we're reading that 99% of our attendees had at least a high school diploma or a GED. When we move down to the different college level degrees that our respondents could have reported, those are actually mutually exclusive. So if we were going to do the math there, then we would have about 9% of our folks that had a high school education or a GED. So you may remember that Karen mentioned a new article in one of the fall webinars that was published in the International Journal of Science Education, Part B. It was written by Kennedy and colleagues, and they found that Britain festival goers tended to be overly educated. And we see that trend in our data again this year as well. So nice connection there to the literature. Here are some of the new data for this year, and these provide some interesting nuance, I think. When breaking out the highest level of education earned by racial categories, it turns out that graduate degree holders of all races are overrepresented among those in our sample. It's also interesting to note that white, Hispanic, Black, and Asian participants, among them, attendees with a college versus advanced degree are fairly evenly split, so that we have a similar percentage from each category for each of those groups. So that same article in IJSE Part B also reported that festival goers in Britain tend to be more economically advantaged based on their household incomes. And you'll remember that we have zip code data to document income levels too. So we also added in some of those results related to income level for this year. So for the sake of simplicity, let's just say the distribution of matched median income across all festival attendees in our sample is approximately normal. And we see one distinct peak in the middle. And then as the distribution spreads out to each side, we see fewer and fewer percentages of our attendees falling into those categories on the low and the high end of the distribution. The gray is also meaningful, the gray bars, in that it gives us the indicators from census data that correspond to those categories. So now what we're going to take a look at are some more nuanced results, where we're going to look at income first by education level, and then we'll be able to look at income by URM status. So what we see first is just a very straightforward visualization that shows us the different income brackets broken out by whether those individuals had a 4-year degree or an advanced degree. And you'll still see that there's a lot of similarity in the way this distribution looks in comparison to the one that we just saw. There's that really nice identifiable peak, and then as you move to the higher and the lower ends of the distribution, you're seeing fewer and fewer cases falling in there. So something interesting happens, I think, when we begin to take URM status into account here. So what we see are the bars representing the percent of folks who identified as URM or underrepresented minority, and how they fall into those different income groups. So just to head off a couple of questions before we do a little bit of interpretation here, there are a couple of things to note about these data. And if you are thinking about some of the findings we gleaned from slide 12 and then looking at this slide here, slide 13, you might say, well, wait, you know, we didn't have a lot of folks at either end of that distribution, and now we're seeing very large percentages at each end. So one of the things to keep in mind is that we're talking about very small samples. So when you have very small samples in those categories, it only takes, you know, 2 or 3 people to really drive that percentage up. So the percentage that we see is a bit inflated, and it's not always a great indicator of what the actual data look like. So do keep that in mind. Additionally, one of the things that we also saw was that some of the folks who were asked the URM question, and this was relevant for the slide, the visualization previously, but they weren't always asked the education question either. So when you begin to think about some of these differences from, you know, these distributions, what they look like, and kind of how things seem to be shifting, please keep that in mind. So with those notes in mind, across the cases with income and race data available, 38% of those cases were identified as a URM. And using that value as a benchmark, URMs are overrepresented at the lowest and the highest medium income bracket. So URMs represented about 50% of those cases with a median local income of less than 15K, and about 2/3 of cases with a median local income of less than 25K. And then on the opposite end of the distribution, we saw URMs accounting for 2/3 of cases with a local median income of 200K or more. But again, we're talking about very small sample sizes, so some of those percentages can be a little bit misleading. So we also wanted to begin to do some comparisons between year 2 and year 3 data. And here we have several items that were asked using a 5-point scale in both year 2 and year 3. And you're going to see us talk a lot about these different items throughout the rest of the presentation. We'll keep coming back to them and parsing them out in different interesting kinds of ways. So one of the reasons that we're interested in the demographic differences is because they sometimes relate to different ratings of the festival. And this kind of analysis gets very complicated very quickly. So as we saw in the HLM analysis that Karen presented a little while back in November, for today, we're going to keep things simple and looking at just our groups who are underrepresented in STEM and see whether their ratings vary based on those single categories alone. So in 2015 and 2016, We examined those differences in several items across gender and racial groups. And similar to years past, we saw that women reported slightly higher rates for learning and feeling inspired by STEM activities at the festival, as well as the event rating overall. And for year 3 data, we saw that all 3 of those differences were statistically significant, whereas in year 2, only the difference between males and females for the learning item was significant. So now we'll take a look here at our STEM majority and URM groups, and we'll start with year 2 ratings. And in year 2, we didn't see a lot of differences between those 2 groups, and we saw a similar pattern this year as well. So not a lot of differences between these 2 groups. None of these findings were statistically significant, which makes sense because there's no real difference there. So here I want to stop for just a second and allow folks to ask clarifying questions, any interpretations, thoughts to share. Do you think we missed anything? Or do you have suggestions for additional analyses that we might take up during next steps?
And so you guys can raise your hand if you want to ask your question out loud to the group, or you can post something in the chat, and Taylor will ask that on your behalf if you'd prefer to do it that way.
So I have a question from Catherine that she typed in. She just wanted to know which races and ethnicities were included in the URM.
Yeah, that's a good question. So we included Hispanic and Latina, Black, African American, and also American Indian or Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander. Any additional questions?
All right, looks like that may be it. Jordan may have just popped a question in.
Sorry, I was having difficulties unmuting myself. Yeah, Jordan said, are there any differences by festival type, city, local versus state, or event size, those types of?
That's a really great question too. We're going to come back to that a little bit later on in the presentation. So I hope that we're going to answer some of the questions that you may have swimming around in your mind. And if not, then maybe we can return to it and think about what additional analyses we might do next with that. But we certainly looked at festival type. We looked at how long a festival had been in operation. We looked at the size of the audience served. And we also looked at host institutions. So whether the festival was embedded in, an educational institution or an informal learning organization or some other type of organization.
And I've got one more question from Ben. He says, are all of the census data compared by region served or by the U.S. total? So for example, with the basic race comparison, is it comparing collective festival reach to full national census data?
We are using full national census data for those comparisons.
And I'll add a comment to that quickly. So the data that we're using here, as Jen said, are the full census data. Catherine has started work on an article that will look at a subset of the data. And for those, we are comparing to city or region and not to the national sample. So there will be some more nuanced analysis coming down the pike in relation to that, and that will hopefully be a little bit more tailored in the comparisons that we can make.
All right, sounds like we're ready to go forward.
I think so.
Okay. All right, so we also wanted to begin to explore some findings across years. So first thing we did, we looked at some of the outcomes and ratings for many of the items that were using a consistent 5-point rating scale across all 3 years of data. So that ended up being the core item about having fun with STEM, whether or not an attendee learned something while they were at the event, whether the attendee or to what degree they felt inspired by something that they did at the event, and then the overall festival rating And here you'll see orange bar is year 1, the blue bar is year 2, gray bar is year 3 with our most recent data. And the findings from year to year are pretty similar. We also took a look at the awareness of STEM in daily life. And you'll remember that the awareness item changed from 2015 to 2016. So prior to 2015, that item was asked with a 5-point Likert scale, but we changed it to a yes/no item in 2016 based on the Think Aloud work that had been done previously. So you also remember that this item is only asked of attendees 18 and up, and you'll see that the totals they're also pretty similar from year to year. So in terms of whether attending the festival affected the awareness of STEM in the respondents' daily life, we saw 92% of respondents reported yes in 2006, and 87% gave us a yes in 2017. So we also looked at some of the information about baseline knowledge of STEM jobs, and you'll remember previously that there was this really nice kind of arc where folks that were coming to the festival with very little knowledge of baseline STEM jobs were really benefiting from being in that environment. So here we see a pretty similar kind of pattern for our folks that came to the festival with no knowledge or just a very little bit of knowledge or even some knowledge. We're seeing that they're reporting some of the higher percentages of walking away with new knowledge about STEM jobs. Also looking at scientist interactions, here we have results from year 1, year 2, and year 3. And if I understand correctly, and Karen, please chime in here, in year 1, there was some discussion about better labeling scientists at events. And then we saw a spike in year 2 data where folks were able to really identify interacting with a STEM professional there at the festival that day. So there was a bit of a jump there from year 1 to year 2, and then from year 2 to year 3, a very small jump in the number of folks who were reporting that they had an interaction with a scientist at the festival. The folks that were reporting that information from past year experiences, we saw a huge jump from year 1 to year 2, but not a lot of difference from year 2 to year 3. We also wanted to look at the percentage of our respondents who were returnees from each year. So in year 1, 31% of respondents reported that they had attended the festival previously. Saw that number climb a little bit in year 2, and then year 3 data, we saw the exact same percentage, 36% reported that they had previously attended the festival. So I think I do want to emphasize Karen's point that I know she's emphasized previously, that this very strongly suggests that there is a small core group of folks who come back and they're repeat attendees, but there's also a very large group of folks that are coming to the festival for the first time. So in terms of, you're preaching to the choir and you're only drawing in the same people from year to year, the data don't support that. So there are a handful of festivals that ask some questions about the economic indicators, and you don't see year 2's percentage reported here, but what we saw in year 3 was very similar. So in year 2, 63% of attendees reported that they plan to shop or dine locally. And here in year 3, we see 68% are reporting that. So there are several festivals that ask some additional questions about expenditures and how much folks have spent or plan to spend while they're attending the festival. And here we see the results compared for year 2 and year 3. And it's worth noting that the fourth, we're not comparing apples and apples here. And I'll tell you in just a second, like kind of why. First, I want to note that there seems to be kind of this large jump in the 51 to 75 category, where we saw 14% of folks falling into that category this year versus 24% last year. And then similarly, we're seeing an increase in the number of big spenders reported this year, so 13% versus 5%. So what we see here is not exactly an apples to apples comparison. So in year 4, there were 4 festivals. I'm sorry, in year 2, there are 4 festivals that asked these questions about, you know, what's your planned expenditure while you're here. And in year 3, 3 festivals asked those questions. So in order to do a real apples to apples comparison to get a better idea of whether folks really are spending, you know, more money when they're coming to the festival, which is a great finding, did want to take a look at the results from only those 3 festivals that asked the question last year and the year before. And here you'll see that the results are a little less impressive if we compare those same 3 festivals across years, but the pattern remains the same. More respondents report spending $75 or more. So we have another stopping point for clarifying questions, interpretations, thoughts to share, anything we missed, or where you think we might go next. I think that means we're okay.
I have a comment from Jordan. He just said, I would guess that repeat attendees would be more likely to refuse a survey. Like they would say, I filled it out last year. That's a comment.
Oh, that's a really good point. We haven't taken a look at that. I did note that there's a 13% refusal rate across our attendees, but that was for the full sample.
Jen and Taylor, do you guys remember? I don't remember people saying anything like that to me, but I'm not sure that they would. I also haven't collected data in the last year or so. Do you guys, but you guys were active and out. Do you remember people saying that as part of their refusals? Or does anybody else on the line, if you were actively out and collecting data?
I don't know that I remember it. Now that I think about it, I don't know that folks who refuse answer any additional questions about whether they've been there in the past. But that's an interesting, you know, empirical point to look at.
Cool. Thanks, Jordan.
Yeah, thanks, Jordan. All right, so here we can begin to move into our within group comparisons. So we also looked at those ratings to see if there are differences for returning and first-time attendees. And you can see here that they were equally high for both groups. So over on the left, we have those items that were asked with that 5-point Likert scale. And then the scientist interaction, we have that information that was asked using a dichotomous scale. I also looked at returnees versus first-timers by URM status, and those results really weren't very interesting, so I chose not to include them here. But about 3/4 of each group was a STEM majority. All right, so we're going to look at festivals by the years in operation, and what the donut shows you here is the percentage of festivals in each category. So just under half of the festivals have been in operation for 2 to 5 years. About 1/4 have been in operation for more than 10 years, or 10 years or more. We also took a look at some of those ratings again, and here we see that there were some differences. So ran some ANOVA tests, and those multiple groups, they only tell us that there are some differences between the groups. So we followed that up with a Bonferroni post hoc test to look more closely at where the differences lie. So we saw differences between the 2 to 5 year group and the 10+ year group for learning, between the 2 and 5 year group and the 6 and 9 year group for inspired, the 2 to 5 year group and the 6 to 9 year group, as well as the 2 to 5 year group and the 10 and more year group for Fun with STEM. And then finally, we saw differences between the youngest festivals between 2 and 5 years old, and both the 6 to 9 and the 10+ years in operation, and between 6 to 9 years and 10+ years for total event rating.
Jen, can I jump in and we go back to that? Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I just ask a quick clarifying question? So I think what that means is that there's a significant step down for each group when it comes to ratings and fun, right?
Yes.
And then for learning, it's just the top group and the bottom group, or is it all three?
For learning, it was the top group and the bottom group.
Okay. And then the top group is significantly higher than both of the other groups for inspired?
Yes.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks. That was probably a much better way of kind of thinking through that. All right, so now we'll move on to host institution, and here the donut shows the percentage of festivals in each of those categories. So about 40% are identified as at least tied to a university in some way, about a quarter informal learning institution, and then about 35% of festivals fall into an other category that's outside of the two just mentioned. So here, the differences really seem to be between festivals classified as other and then both universities and formal learning institutions. So the differences between other and both university and informal learning institution, let me show you these here. For learning, and then there were differences in other and informal learning institution for Fun with STEM. And then again, differences between other and both university and informal learning institution for overall event rating. So again, like in some, it's really suggesting that the festivals that are best classified as other are significantly different in some ways than university and informal learning institution-based festivals. So we also wanted to take a look at audience served here. So we have some indicators about festival size, and you know, Karen and I have had some good conversations about, you know, how to best break down these categories. So if you have feedback on that, I think we would, you know, be more than open to it. So about 30% of the festivals among our partners serve 50,000 or more attendees. And then we see variation in the other categories, and about a quarter of our festivals serve less than 5,000. So I thought it might be interesting to take a look at how our largest festivals compare to smallest festivals. So again, we're looking at those same 4 items: overall rating, whether someone felt inspired, whether they learned something, and then also whether they have fun with STEM. And here, because we're just looking at 2 groups, the results are a little bit more straightforward to interpret. Generally speaking, we saw that the smallest festivals had higher ratings on all 4 of those items, and the difference on the overall event rating and then also the item about fun with STEM, those differences were statistically significant. No, dropping in there. All right, so I think this is our last one that we break out. So we also were interested in whether the sampling rule used would result in any differences in the ratings for those 4 indicators that we've been talking about. So here, what the donut shows you is the percentage of cases in the data set by sampling rule. So about 58%, about a little over half, use the 5th person rule. 9% use consensus. 11% either use a survey or surveys under the seat, and then about 21% use some other kind of sampling rule. So we see that there are some differences, primarily when we're thinking about whether someone reports learning having occurred in the festival context. The other differences were negligible, and none of those were statistically significant. So here, what we see primarily for the learning item is the difference we're seeing reflect differences between utilizing surveys under the seats compared to using consensus for the 5th person rule. All right, so with that, we're now back to another point where we can have folks chime in with questions or comments, and then I'm going to turn it over to Karen to talk a little bit about value and use.
All right. So you just saw a whole bunch of new stuff for the first time. Go ahead, Taylor.
I just got a question from Paula and a comment from Ben. So Paula wants to know, what does the other category include for other types of formal institutions that are tied to the festivals?
Karen, I'm going to move that one back.
I wish I had somebody to pitch it to also. So it's sort of a hodgepodge. The easiest way to answer it is that if you are not based out of a university, and if you're not based out of an informal learning institution, then you are an other. There's not a lot of cohesion in that other group, which is why it is so cleverly named other. So I would guess, Paula, that you guys are in the other group because I think you're classified as a nonprofit. If you're out of your state commerce office, like the Arizona Festival, I think they are in the other category. I'm trying to think if there are other particular categories that I know fall into that. And I'm not sure, none others are coming to my head off the top of my head. Catherine, feel free to chime in if you remember anything else about what we put in this group originally. Anybody else have questions about the data you just saw? Or interpretations?
Ben just had a comment that he was very surprised to see that there were so many festivals reporting being in existence for 10 or more years, that he could only think of 3 or 4 Evalfest festivals that are that established.
Yeah, I was surprised at that too when Jen and I looked at them, but 3 or 4 out of only 24 festivals is actually a pretty good chunk. So Jen, let me go back. If you'll go back up a couple slides, let's go back to the age one for a minute, or the sort of how seasoned the festival is. So one way to interpret these data are that those of us who have been around the longest need to do something to freshen up our programming, right? There's another potential interpretation here that maybe the longer you've been around, the larger your festival has grown and the less control you have over things. So I don't know if this feels like good food for thought or not, because it's just different levels of goodness, right? Like we're all well above 4 for the overall rating and well above 4 for fun with STEM. So there are different ways to interpret these data. And I'd be interested if anybody has other interpretations they want to share. Catherine, I can see you've got your hand up, so let me unmute you real fast. Oh, it's not letting me do it. It says you're self-muted.
Oh,
Can
there
you?
you go.
Oh, there you are.
Can you hear me now?
Hi.
Hi.
I can.
I mean, part of the way that I look at this is from an attendee perspective. When you go to a festival I mean, maybe you need to break out returning versus someone brand new, right? If you go to an expo event for the first time, like, it's just amazing. And when you go for subsequent years, it's still amazing and it's still wonderful. But it doesn't surprise me that some of these ratings go down a tiny little bit, even though it's still a great thing.
Yeah, that could be it. So we've looked at, that's one explanation, right? We've looked at overall ratings for returning versus new, and those are the same, but we haven't looked at that within each of these additional buckets. Does anybody else find these results surprising, encouraging? Think it doesn't matter? All of those seem like they could be possible and reasonable interpretations.
Yeah, I think I don't know. For me, I don't see that much in this particular breakdown, and that when something is new in a community, it doesn't surprise me that it gets higher ratings.
Okay. All right. Let's see. Does anybody else want to look at any of these others? Jen, maybe flip through the rest of them again for just a second or two and see. Any comments about these? This one, I think, if I had to guess why learning is so much higher for surveys under seats, it's because there's only a certain kind of event where surveys under seats make sense. And those tend to be very content heavy lecture hall events. And so to me, that result feels kind of intuitive. One of the things that we've wondered over time is that, the fifth person rule is important because you want to get out any bias that you might have. But we don't see a lot of difference in any bias that might be coming through in these results. So I don't want to undermine the fifth person rule. I think it's still important that we all try to do it. But it's not really showing a different level of the kind of results that we see based on the data that we do have. Anybody else have a comment, question, interpretation to share about any of these data before we move on?
So we've got a couple comments from Ben and a question from Jordan. So the first one from Ben, he just said, the chart bars are a little misleading. Some small differences are exaggerated. So it is interesting how similar many of these scores are. And then he also said, survey under seats means there are seats.
Yes.
And Jordan's question is, how much of our data are from expo or carnival events versus other?
Jen, remind me if we limited these to expo or if we looked at everything.
We looked at everything.
Yeah. So this is the entire sample of 9,000 whatever that we got from last year. When we have the work that we started to do for publication purposes looks at expos only, so that we are doing more of an apples to apples. And that's probably relevant for the surveys under seats piece as well, right? There are probably very few of our expos, although some of them do include workshops or presentations. There are probably very few expos that even have this survey under seat as a possibility because they are more of that carnival style. All right, so I am going to, oh, Jen, can you make me presenter?
Maybe. Just being honest. Let's see. Change presenter.
So usually up in the right, there's a little share thing.
Okay.
That I think you can only see if you're currently the presenter. Yeah, there we go. Nicely done. Okay. So we do want to talk a little bit, about value and use, in part because we've collected data from all of you about value and use for the last several years, but we've not shown you any of the results. Now we know that some of you don't care about these results very much, and so that's probably just fine with you that you haven't seen very many of them. But some of the data that we have speak directly to the use of community level data, like those that you've just seen from Jen. And so we thought this would be a good chance to give you just a teeny look at what you and some of your fellow Evalfest partners have said. So these are data that Jen has analyzed over the last year to look at the different kinds of things that you guys value about data. Now there's a lot that lives in this slide, and because we have mixed levels of interest among you, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about a lot of it. What I did want to point out though is the color coding and where data start to become important. So we have immediate value on the left, potential value in the middle, and applied value on the right. And what is lovely and heartwarming to see is the dominant data part of that donut on the far right. Now, this project, the Evalfest project, is supposed to be all about evaluation use and using your data. And so in some ways, this is kind of a no-brainer. But if you think about all of the bad evaluation out in the world, or all of the evaluation that people find to be meaningless, or they don't even enter it, it's just sitting and gathering dust under somebody's desk somewhere, I think this is a great number. So this is examples that you guys have given of the exact ways that you've taken your data and made use of them. And you'll see some other examples about that in a minute. There are two other kinds of value that we see fewer festivals having sort of reported so far, which is not a failure. It's just where people are finding things to be meaningful to them. So realized value and reframing value both have a significant number of data related pieces. And you'll see some specific examples of what those things mean in a slide or two. I also wanted to use this opportunity to give you guys an update. We have officially submitted, as of December, our first manuscript related to the Evalfest project. So Jen and I worked on a manuscript that went into the American Journal of Evaluation that is basically the story of who we are as a project. It's how we took the evaluation research and applied it in practice to create what Evalfest is. If you guys are interested in reading that draft, we are happy to make it available to you. But here are a couple of the headlines. So the majority of you are using both your own festival results and the community level results in at least one way. And so that's one of the headlines, the community created piece. One of the things that we said was unique about Evalfest is that, multi-site evaluations happen a lot, but it's very rare that everybody has access to all of the data, or that those cumulative results like you saw today get presented back to the community. And so what was nice to see in some of the examples that you all have provided in interviews over the last couple of years is specific examples of ways that you're using not only your own festival results, but the Evalfest level results as well. The cool thing about that from an academic standpoint is the second headline, which is that if we look at the levels of use that you guys are making of your data and of this project, compared to those that we find in the literature, and there aren't that many, but the ones that we could find, we are similar to or higher in the level of use that we see for this community created approach when we compare our results to other more traditional approaches in the literature. So that was pretty cool and pretty fun to be able to write up and report, and we'll let you know how we go with the publication for that piece and if it gets accepted. This is what we're talking about. So when it comes to different kinds of use, there's this kind of use called process use, and that has to do with learning and changes in perception and approach based on the fact that an evaluation happened itself. So it doesn't have anything to do with the findings. It has more to do with the evaluation process and how that gets applied. And so the first quote here focuses on an organizational shift that has happened in one of your organizations and just how people think about the value of evaluation overall. And the second focuses on the importance of having community level results like the ones that we saw today. I once attended a presentation where they said people can read faster than people can talk. So I'm not going to read these to you because I figure you've probably already read them. If you haven't, then get going because I'm about to switch slides. So conceptual use, the second category you see here, is defined as new things that the evaluation results have taught you about your festival. And the majority of you have shared examples of conceptual use as well over time. And so the examples that you see on the screen give you a specific example in the first case that has to do with festival level results, and then an example from the community level results and the community level approach that we use for this project. So those are the first two kinds of use in the literature that are commonly cited. Here are the second two, or the second two of four. And you can see that 3/4 of you are reporting use in each of these categories as well. If we look at the instrumental use, which is using findings to make specific changes to your festival, the examples target how to recruit attendees, how to find people to come to the festival in the first place, and then thinking about the kinds of booths that should be at a festival or should not be at a festival in the next year. Most of our symbolic use has to do with asking more funding or recruiting new partners to be part of the festival. The first example that you see here is an example of that latter category. And then the second example focuses on using the evaluation results to help verify the existence of the festival itself. So that's sort of a quick tour through some of the results and some of the ways people have used their data. We hope that these will be inspirational as you think about whether and how to use some of the analysis that you saw today, if you want to model that with your own festival data, or maybe even some of the results. So we have one publication out the door, but that is not all. We have 2 more that should go in by the end of this month, so we're pretty stoked about that, and then at least 2 more that are coming down the pike later this year. So I wanted to give you a preview of those as well. Kaya and Teresa are putting the finishing touches on a manuscript that describes the results of the timing and tracking study that they did last year. This is going to be the first publication submitted about one of the Evalfest mini grants, and so we're super excited about the progress that these two have made. And then you can see some of the headlines from their paper here. So waiting at a festival booth is not necessarily a bad thing. It can be a nice indication of the draw of that event for children. You'll remember that their timing and tracking protocol focused on children specifically. And then parental interaction increases engagement time at a booth. We would hope that that would be true, right? So this is a nice example of something that you hope to see in the data that they do in fact have evidence to support. And so we'll stay tuned for that. Kaya and Teresa expect to have that manuscript in final draft form by the end of the month and then submitted a little bit later in the year. The same is true for a manuscript that Amy and Mac and I are working on together. This one has to do with the engagement results that we collected data on the first couple years of the project. And what's fun about this one is that there are 4 festivals who were involved in that data collection, and so they will all be acknowledged both as a group and as individuals for this paper as well. So this one has the potential to involve a lot of us directly and indirectly. And the headline here is what we already know, right? You can't assume that an off-the-shelf instrument that was validated in one context is going to work in another. There's actually very little work in the literature to talk about the process that you go through to see if something does work. And so that's what the focus of this paper is going to be. And we don't know what all the headlines are yet. Amy is still crunching some numbers on this one to have a final big headline, but we are in the home stretch with that and hope to have this done and submitted within the next month or so as well. So then we have upcoming dates and a quick update related to that. So our next webinar is going to be on March 8th. Todd is going to lead the charge with that one, and his topic I think sounds fascinating: evaluation from a funder's perspective. So tune in on March 8th to learn more about what that is about. Catherine is going to lead the webinar on April 19th. Note that that is a slightly different date than our regular schedule. The topic for that one is still to be determined. Then on May 10th, we are going to focus on analysis, reporting, or both. There may or may not be a presenter for May 10th. I'm going to be in the lead with that one, and the exact content for that is going to depend in part on the last item you see on the slide here, which is whether or not we are successful at getting the supplemental grant to have another annual meeting. Whether or not we do that, there is still this thing coming up on June 4th and 5th in St. Pete that is the Science Event Summit, formerly known as IPSEC. And so I got a note in my email feed the other day, I'm sure all of you did as well, that early bird registration is open through, I think, the 5th of March. Ben, correct me if that's wrong. So we hope that everybody will be going to the Science Event Summit, whether or not we are able to have an Evalfest meeting. And then we do hope that the Evalfest meeting will be able to happen in the 2 days following this year's Science Event Summit. We have pinged our program officer to find out when we might know something about that, and we still are not sure what that timeline is, but hopefully we will have updates for you all soon. And that is all we have for today. If you have extra questions or comments that you want us to answer, please type them in the chat and we will get back to you with anything that you have. Otherwise, thank you very much for tuning in, and we will see you again next month. Bye, everybody.